So for our final block of flash talks is going to focus to a significant extent on transparency. One of the ways we have been able to become informed about the extent of government surveillance is not just through leaks from folks like Edward Snowden, but via transparency reports that major platforms are increasingly producing to try and provide a measure of visibility by the public, not obviously into the specifics of who the government is looking for information on, but at least the scale and what sort of authorities are being used for that purpose. So we're going to have two talks from major platforms about their transparency reports. I'd like to start with Facebook's head of strategic initiatives and response, Alexandra Galloway.
Hello, as he said, I'm Alex Galloway, and one of the things that our team is in charge of at Facebook is our Transparency Hub, formerly known as the Government Request Report, but we've been expanding it significantly. So I'll start out with some really high-level points on why do we do the Transparency Report. And so as Julian just said, originally this was really just focused on our government requests, and that was the name of the report. And it was to hold governments accountable for the information they request, to provide insight into how often we provide data to governments and the rigorous process we have in place to review these requests, and to provide some context on the relative scale of how many users the government is requesting information on. It's evolved significantly. We try and add more information every year. And now it includes a little bit more in helping the world understand better how to measure the work companies like ours do to make users safe, both physically and also their data, and to hold ourselves publicly accountable for the actions we take in these spaces. So I won't go into all the pieces here, but this is sort of a timeline of all the things we've been adding since we launched our first report back in 2013. So each year, each half, we release a report, and we try to add a little bit more information based on the feedback we've got from people like you in the room about what's important. So we'll be focusing on the government-related spokes of the Transparency Report, but I'll go over just really quick a high level of what the 5 reports we currently publish are. So the newest one is our Community Standards Report. We also do our government requests for data, content restrictions based on local law, intellectual property infringement, and internet disruptions. So in our Community Standards Enforcement Report, we cover information about what actions we're taking to take content off the platform for violations of our community standards, such as graphic violence, terrorist propaganda, child nudity, and sexual exploitation. And we're really seeking to answer 5 key questions here for people. How prevalent were those violations? When by prevalence, we mean how often are you likely to see these violations? How much content did we take action on? How much violating content did we find before users even reported it? How we proactively detect, how quickly we take action on violations, and how often we correct our mistakes. So currently we publish data on the first 3 of these questions. The last 2 questions are still in development, but we have them on our site because we want to hold ourselves accountable to the commitment to publish this information eventually. So content restrictions based on local law. What content restrictions based on local law is this is content that we geo-block or restrict in certain areas based on local laws, even if it doesn't violate our community standards. So the quintessential example of this is sort of Holocaust denial, where we will block it in areas where Holocaust denial is illegal, but not take it off the platform completely. So government requests for data, which we'll dive deeper into some of these subjects later. But the main questions we're trying to answer for people currently are how often do governments ask us for data? How many accounts are requested with those requests? How often we comply with these requests? And how often we're disclosing based on national security orders. Intellectual property infringement covers our enforcement of counterfeit copyright and trademark infringement. And internet disruptions is how often people are blocked from using Facebook products and services in places where they're otherwise available. So our government requests. For the last report, we covered data from the first six months of 2018. And for the first time, we had over 100,000 requests this half. So we complied by producing at least some data in about 74% of those instances. The highest number of requests by far comes from the United States with over 40,000 requests, followed by India, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Brazil. Together, the United States and the other top 5 countries represent almost 80% of the total requests we receive worldwide. Our global requests for the first half of 2018 were up 26%, which is pretty on trend with how we've been seeing growth. The reason this growth is happening is, first of all, because Facebook's growing and there's more users all the time, but also law enforcement is getting more tech savvy and coming to us more often and understanding how to request data from us. We've seen the upward trend in all regions. So in the Asia Pacific area countries, it was up 30%. In Latin America, it was up 10%. In the North American countries, just over 20%. And in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we saw it go up 20%. There are 2 types of requests we get from governments, and we started breaking these out because it's important to understand the difference between why we disclose here. So emergency requests are when law enforcement submits requests to us without legal process, and we may voluntarily disclose if we have a good faith reason to believe the matter involves an imminent risk of serious bodily injury or death. Again, for emergency requests, they are a small fraction of what we receive. The rest of the requests are legal process, which means we comply with those based only on applicable law and our terms of service. So these are things like search warrants or subpoenas that we receive. The United States makes up 1/3 of all of our emergency requests, followed by the United Kingdom, Canada, India, Israel, and Mexico. So there's actually a different number of highest requesters for emergency requests than there is for legal process requests. So our content restrictions based on local law. Trends over time are a little bit misleading here because sometimes we see really high spikes based on a certain piece of content we've restricted multiple times. So for example, when you see July to December 2015, that huge spike was the result of a single piece of content being restricted over 36,000 times. However, if you take out some of those unusual incidents, we do see governments requesting us to take down content based on local law at an increasing rate, half over half. Internet disruptions. So as I said, this is when Facebook products or services are blocked in certain countries. Its trends over time aren't very helpful because these are very specific to sort of the political climate in individual countries, which really fluctuate each half. But in the first half of 2018, we saw 8 countries blocking Facebook products or services 48 times. 83% of those disruptions, or 40 out of the 48, were in India, restricting access to Facebook products and services for just over 11 weeks, where people couldn't access them. Interestingly, although India blocked our services more times, in other countries they were blocked for longer. So in Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Iran, they were blocked for over 25 weeks in each of those countries, followed by Chad, which was blocked for 13 weeks, and the rest were under 1 week each. So in terms of what's next, as I mentioned, we're continuing to grow the transparency report and try to identify what information is useful for people so they can take this data and hold their governments accountable and have meaningful conversations about what kind of data people are requesting from us and what we're doing on our platform. So going forward, we're working to stabilize our metrics enough so that we can report every single category of harmful content. Right now, we only report 7 different types. We're going to be expanding that. And looking at additional metrics, as I mentioned, about how many mistakes we make and how fast we get to things. Metrics are always a problem in this space because we want to, first of all, use the right metric so that it's neutral and people can understand it and use that information without sort of being colored. So you'll see in the transparency report, we go to great efforts to really just present the data each half without a narrative around what our conclusions are, what we think, or like trying to develop a narrative around it. It's specifically to just really get that raw data out there. We're also developing infrastructure to move to quarterly reporting. Previously, we've done this by half, and we're going to move to quarterly. So this is a priority of Mark Zuckerberg's to basically keep this on cadence with our quarterly earnings because this sort of thing is just as important as those are. We're also going to start doing calls with Facebook leadership, accompanying every transparency release with policymakers and academics and the press so that they can ask questions and hear directly from us on what our take is on this data each half. we're also trying to expand third-party engagement. So that's a lot with the academic community and policymakers as well, so that we can sort of pull back the curtain a little bit and get feedback and be a little bit more collaborative around our policymaking and our appeals process, in addition to expanding research projects. And so that's sort of finding data that's really useful to people who are looking hard at these issues so that we can share that data with them and they can give us feedback about how we can better do our work. So I really look forward to working with some of the people in this room on this going forward and talking to you after this.
Thanks, Alex. And just for, I think, contrast or comparison, I think it's illuminating to look at something like this from the perspective of a couple different companies. I wouldn't want anyone to think we were favoritism towards Facebook, so I'd like to ask David Lieber of Google to talk about their own transparency report.
Thank you, Julian. So we, like Facebook, have a number now of different transparency reports, a total of 12 that span a different sort of spectrum of content, including privacy and security, content removals, and then a third category right now, which is really just a catch-all, but includes things like our transparency report around political advertising, which is relatively new. We published our first transparency report that covered government requests for user data in 2010, and we did it for a couple of different reasons. The first was just to inform the public about the nature, volume, and scope of government requests for user data that we receive. But the second reason was to really inform the broader debate around government surveillance. And that's what I really want to focus my lightning talk on today, about 3 discrete areas where I think we made a difference, or at least we've shed some light on some of the numbers behind the relevant debates. And those 3 areas are Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act demands, national security letters, and emergency requests. Let me move this on. This just gives you a glimpse, bird's eye view of the number of government requests that we've received worldwide over the past 9 or 10 years since we started publishing our transparency report. In and of itself, the numbers themselves aren't necessarily going to provide you with a ton of useful insight, other than to see, I think, as Alexandra had recognized, that we're seeing an increasing number of demands. But as you also see in recent reporting periods, the number of users and accounts that have been impacted by those demands have gone up significantly. It's difficult to extrapolate from the numbers just what's behind them. Certainly, user growth is one explanation, but in terms of explaining the growth, at least in the numbers of users and accounts that are impacted, there are a lot of different reasons, and some of it really is speculation as to why over one particular reporting period you might see a significant spike versus other reporting periods. I spoke at the Cato Surveillance Conference in 2013. I think it's important to sort of go back because we tend to lose sight of some of the gains that we made in transparency here. When I spoke in October of 2013, I believe, in this room, we were in a position where we could not disclose, we could not even acknowledge that we received Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act demands from the United States government. Full stop. So when we talked about it, or when I talked about it here, I had to be very careful about speaking about demands that we might receive, assuming that we may receive any. That's the predicament we were in at the time, constrained in terms of our ability to speak about accurate and truthful information in terms of the aggregate demands, national security demands that we receive. Even 1 month later, when our Director for Law Enforcement and Information Security, Rick Salgado, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, he was there on behalf of the world's largest internet company, advocating in support of legislation that would enable us to speak truthfully about these types of demands. And yet, at the same time, there was an interesting exchange between Senator Leahy and my colleague Rick, in which Senator Leahy sort of had asked asked him whether he was here arguing for the ability to say more about the demands that we receive, and my colleague said yes, and he said, and yet you can't acknowledge right now that you actually get these demands. He said, that's also true, Senator. We are in a different place now, in part because of the USA Freedom Act, which was enacted in 2015. The USA Freedom Act gave companies like Google and Facebook the ability to say more about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act demands that we receive, and to provide a little bit more insight into the nature of those demands. And what you're seeing here, for example, is just some reporting around some recent periods where we received FISA non-content requests. And in this realm, there's not a lot that's terribly interesting for people. You can see in a particular range how many demands we received and how many users and accounts that were impacted. And you can see that's relatively consistent, at least among sort of non-content. Gets a little bit more interesting, I think, when you're looking at content requests. The USA Freedom Act enables us to speak with a little bit of granularity in terms of requests that we receive both for content and for non-content, and to report in bands. And you can report in different bands, different ranges, depending on how granular the types of disclosures that you're making. We report in bands of 500. You can see that the numbers are consistent here, at least in terms of the number of demands that have been made, but very different in terms of the numbers of users and accounts that have been impacted. Some of you may know that the USA Freedom Act, believe it or not, is scheduled to expire toward the end of next year. It is an appropriate time for Congress to revisit some of the constraints that are placed on providers in terms of disclosing information about demands that we receive. And to be clear, the Department of Justice has been a very good partner in terms of enabling us to be more transparent here. And in 2013, in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, it was understandable that there were some concerns about the national security implications of providers for the first time making the types of disclosures that we have been making now for a number of years. But flash forward now, and at the end of 2018, we're reporting in bands of 500. And query whether there is a national security moment, if you will, if a company like Google is disclosing 500 to 999 on the one hand and 731 on the other. And by the way, that comes off the top of my head. Not looking to get an orange pinstripes anytime soon. So, but it is an appropriate now time to consider whether we should be able to speak with a little bit more granularity and shed a little bit more light on the demands that we receive. Some folks who are familiar with FISA can understand differences between content and non-content, but even the ability, for example, to report by authority. Some folks here may be familiar with what's known as Section 215 or Section 702. Being able to break down requests in terms of that type of granularity would be useful. It would help folks understand exactly where the focus is of our government in terms of seeking data from companies like Google. Let me turn now to national security letters. This has also been an area where I think the government has been a good partner in terms of enabling us to say more about the demands that we receive. And this isn't, by the way, just transparency for its own sake here. The USA Freedom Act also required the U.S. Department of Justice to look on a more regular and periodic basis at the non-disclosure orders that typically accompany national security letters, and to ask whether there was a need for providers to be gagged, for lack of a better word, on an ongoing and indefinite basis. And to its credit, the Department of Justice has taken this responsibility seriously. They've looked at national security letters that have been issued to providers like Google in the past, and they've questioned and they've looked and they said there's no longer a need for us to have this non-disclosure obligation be placed on you, and we're releasing you from that and allowing you to publish to publish the fact that you received this letter. But not only that, the text of the national security letter itself. And when I say it's not just transparency for transparency's sake, if you look at the national security letters that companies like Google and Facebook and others have received, and others have published the text of the letters themselves, what you're seeing is that the national security letters are asking for certain types of information that are authorized under the statute. And NSLs, I should have started and said, national security letters are sort of the equivalent of subpoenas in the domestic context. They enable they enable the Department of Justice to get a limited subset of data, the types of information that you would provide when you, for example, are signing up for a Google account, your name, your address, maybe a credit card number, some other basic information. But what we've also been able to, I think, learn as a result of the disclosure of these NSLs, the text, is that the Department of Justice has also invited providers to provide another set of information called electronic communication transaction records, or ECTRs. There's been an ongoing debate about whether the underlying national security letter statute authorizes the Department of Justice to obtain ECTRs with a national security letter. And there's even been a legislative proposal to require providers to provide a broad universe of information, the ECTRs themselves. That's a source of ongoing debate. We have some real concerns with it. But I think the point I would make here is that but for the ability to publish these national security letters themselves, it would be opaque to the public that these records, these electronic communication transaction records, have been requested from companies. So transparency is going to help inform the debate to the extent that this issue arises again in the future. Let me make one other okay, so emergency requests. Alexander talked a little bit about this. The domestic law in the United States here, the Stored Communications Act, authorizes providers like Google, authorizes but does not require us to disclose information where there's a serious risk of bodily injury or death on an emergency basis and without legal process. When we testified before Congress in 2013, separately in support of the Email Privacy Act, or what became the Email Privacy Act, the ongoing piece of legislation that everyone thinks should pass but never does. Hopefully we'll do it in 2019. We were having this discussion, and we testified before Congress. A law enforcement official testified and made the assertion that at least some providers have a policy of categorically refusing to disclose data on an emergency basis, and that providers have and that some providers have demanded that they receive compulsory process or search warrants. To us, that certainly wasn't the case. At the time, we weren't disclosing that data. We weren't providing any insight into the emergency requests that we received. And the implication, at least for some who saw the testimony, was that the biggest providers were the ones that were not providing data on a voluntary basis in emergency situations. For us, and I know for a number of other providers, this is the most serious type of request that we receive. It's one of the reasons we're staffed 24/7, 365, because if there is that type of a risk, we want to be in a position to provide the data. We don't want to see anybody seriously harmed or killed as a result of us not being able to provision data in a situation where time is of the essence. So we did disclose that data. We started to disclose that data. What you're seeing is the latest transparency report, which shows quite clearly that when we get emergency requests, we do disclose that data the vast majority of the time. We saw other providers follow suit and publish the same data. And I think what we saw as a result of this is that none of the major service providers are requiring warrants in situations where there is an emergency. That has helped to inform the debate because there have been proposals to require service providers, in part because there was this belief that we were not disclosing this data voluntarily, to require service providers without a warrant to disclose this information on the mere invocation of an emergency without a concomitant showing that the emergency exists. And so this is an ongoing issue in the policy realm around the issue of the Email Privacy Act about whether companies should be required to disclose this data when law enforcement agencies come to us and say that there's an emergency. So that is it. I just wanted to be able to shed a little bit light on the policy implications behind some of the information that we've published, and I think we're going to continue to try and innovate and to recognize situations where we think more data can help to inform the public policy debates. Thanks.